You don't realize what you had until the one person who never made you feel like you had to fight for love stops fighting for you. And that's the part nobody prepares you for. Because when someone is deeply empathic, what I'd call a super empath, they don't love halfway. They don't connect halfway. They don't show up with conditions or emotional games. They show up fully, with presence, with understanding, with patience that often feels almost spiritual. But here's the truth most people miss. That kind of love doesn't feel valuable to someone who is emotionally avoidant in the beginning. Because avoidants are not chasing depth, at first they're protecting themselves from it. They are wired to associate closeness with pressure and vulnerability with danger. So when they meet someone who offers emotional safety, consistency, and unconditional understanding, they don't always experience it as love. They experience it as something unfamiliar, something they keep at arm's length, something they assume will always be there, no matter how they behave. And that assumption becomes the silent destroyer of connection. Because the empath over time starts to feel the imbalance. They start to sense that their depth is being met with distance. Their effort is being met with withdrawal. Their love is being met with emotional absence. And slowly, something powerful happens inside them. They stop chasing, not because they stopped loving, but because they started respecting themselves. And this is where the shift begins. Because for the avoidant, nothing feels different at first. They still feel in control. They still feel fine. They still believe the emotional space is safe because the empath always came back, always explained, always softened the edges of disconnection. But then one day, they don't. And that silence is not just silence. It's revelation. Because now the avoidant is forced to sit in a space they've never properly learned to sit in: absence without control, love without access, emotional warmth that is no longer available on demand. And this is where the truth finally arrives. Not in theory, not in advice, but in feeling. They start remembering moments they dismissed, the way that person looked at them with understanding, even when they didn't deserve it, the way peace entered their life when that person was around, the way emotional chaos softened just by their presence. But now, that presence is gone. And here's the divine principle hidden inside all of this. Love is not recognized in its presence by those who are still learning emotional maturity. It is recognized in its absence, when the heart is finally forced to feel the cost of disconnection. The empath didn't lose, they completed their part of the lesson. They loved fully, they gave truthfully, they honored their own emotional limits. The avoidant, on the other hand, enters the classroom of loss. Not punishment, but awakening. Because when the super empath walks away, they don't just take love with them. They take regulation. They take peace. They take emotional grounding. They take the one mirror that showed the avoidant what safety could feel like. And now the avoidant is left alone with the echo of what they once had, and the realization that not every love waits forever. And maybe that is the point. Not to create suffering, but to create awareness. Because sometimes the deepest growth doesn't happen when someone stays and explains everything. It happens when they finally leave, and you are forced to feel what you were too distracted to appreciate. Avoidant individuals often mistake emotional distance for emotional safety, because for most of their lives, distance has been their coping mechanism. It is not that they do not feel, it is that they learned early on that feeling too much, needing too much, or expressing too much could lead to discomfort, rejection, or emotional overwhelm. So instead of developing a secure relationship with closeness, they develop a protective relationship with space. And over time, that space starts to feel like home. When someone grows up or lives long enough in emotional environments where consistency is unpredictable, they begin to equate calm with far away. So when a deeply loving, emotionally available person enters their life, someone who offers presence, attention, then it's like a homecoming. And emotional honesty, it doesn't always register as safety. Instead, it can feel like pressure. Not because the partner is doing anything wrong, but because closeness activates internal alarm systems that were never healed. The nervous system doesn't distinguish between healthy intimacy and past emotional overwhelmment, simply reacts to intensity. And for the avoidant, even healthy emotional closeness can feel intense. So what do? They regulate that discomfort by stepping back. They text less. They open up selectively. They create emotional breathing room. And in that space, something interesting happens in their mind. The anxiety reduces, not because the relationship is healthier, but because distance numbs emotional activation. That numbness gets misinterpreted as peace. And this is where the confusion begins. Because peace in its true form is not numbness. Peace is not absence of feeling. But for the avoidant, the nervous system has been trained in such a way that reduced emotional intensity equals stability. So when they pull away and feel calmer, they unconsciously conclude, this feels better. This feels safer. But what they are actually experiencing is emotional detachment, not emotional security. Meanwhile, the emotionally available partner, the empathic type, experiences distance very differently. For them, connection is not a threat, it is nourishment. So when the avoidant pulls away, the empath leans in. They try to understand, to fix, to re-establish closeness. They offer more patience, more explanation, more emotional holding. And this dynamic reinforces the avoidant's belief that they can come and go, without consequence, because the empath keeps bridging the gap. But over time, something subtle shifts. The empath begins to feel unseen, not unloved, but unreciprocated. They start to sense that their emotional presence is not being met with equal presence. And this is where their growth begins. Because empathy without boundaries eventually turns into depletion. So they begin to step back not as punishment, but as self-respect. And this is the first moment the avoidant is confronted with a different kind of emotional reality. At first, the avoidant still feels that same safety and distance. They may even rationalize it. I just need space. I'm not good with emotions. I'm better on my own. But what they don't immediately realize is that they are no longer choosing distance while having access to love. They are now sitting in distance without the emotional safety net they once took for granted. The empath's presence used to soften their internal world, even when they were not fully aware of it. That emotional regulation is now gone. And here is where the deeper truth begins to surface slowly, almost painfully. The absence of the empath does not feel like relief anymore. It begins to feel like silence where warmth used to be. It feels like a space that no longer responds when they reach out emotionally. It feels unfamiliar, not because it is new, but because they are finally alone with what they used to avoid feeling. What was once mistaken for emotional safety is now revealed to be emotional avoidance. The super empath is not just someone who feels deeply. They are someone who processes emotional reality with a level of awareness, intuition, and responsiveness that most people don't even realize exists until they experience it. They don't just hear words, they feel the emotional truth behind them. They don't just observe behavior, they sense the intention, the fear, the wound underneath it. And because of that, they often end up carrying emotional weight. Was never theirs to begin with. What makes this kind of person so powerful in relationships is not that they love intensely, but that they love with understanding. They don't rush to judge. They don't immediately withdraw when things get complicated. Instead, they try to understand the story behind the behavior. If someone pulls away, they don't instantly label them as disinterested. They ask, what is this distance protecting? If someone struggles to express emotion, they don't see coldness, they see fear, conditioning, or unresolved pain. So in the early stages of connection with an avoidant individual, the super empath becomes almost like emotional oxygen. They are patient in a way that feels rare. They are consistent in a way that feels grounding. They are present in a way that doesn't demand performance. And for someone who is used to emotional pressure or past instability, this can feel like relief, even if they don't fully recognize it at first. But the super empath's love has a unique pattern. It is expansive, but not limitless in a self-destructive way. At first, they absorb everything. They listen more than they speak. They adjust more than they demand. They give more than they receive, not because they lack self-worth, but because they genuinely believe that love can heal people when it is consistent enough, patient enough, and safe enough. And often, they are right, but only to a point. Because what the super empath eventually realizes is that understanding someone does not automatically mean they are willing to understand themselves. And holding space for someone does not guarantee that they will step into that space with you. So while the empath continues to offer depth, the avoidant may continue to oscillate between closeness and withdrawal, connection and distance. The empath begins to notice something subtle but important. They are doing the emotional work for two people. They are interpreting silence, softening conflict, creating reassurance, and constantly recalibrating their emotional expression so the other person does not feel overwhelmed. And at first, this feels like love. It feels like commitment. It feels like being the bigger person. But over time, something deeper starts to form inside them, not resentment at first, but exhaustion. Because emotional generosity without reciprocity slowly turns into emotional depletion. They begin to realize that their presence is being treated as something stable and permanent, rather than something valuable and chosen. They are there, so it is assumed they will always be there. And this is where the shift begins, not in anger, but in clarity. The super empath starts to recognize that love is not just about understanding someone else's wounds, it is also about honoring their own emotional limits. They begin to see that constantly overextending themselves is not healing the other person is simply enabling emotional avoidance. Because when someone is always met without consequence, they never have to confront the impact of their distance. So the empath begins to change, not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly and intentionally. They stop over-explaining. They stop chasing emotional clarity from someone who repeatedly avoids it. They stop filling every silence with reassurance. Not because they care less, but because they finally start caring for themselves at the same level they have been caring for the other person. And from the outside, it may look like detachment. It may look like withdrawal. But internally, it is alignment. It is the moment they stop abandoning themselves in the name of understanding someone else. What makes this dynamic so powerful is that the empath doesn't leave because they stop loving. They leave because they finally start respecting the imbalance. And that shift changes everything, because now love is no longer just an offering, it is a standard. Avoidant individuals only recognize emotional value when consistent love is no longer available, because familiarity creates blindness. When something is always present, always accessible, and always forgiving, the mind stops registering it as something that can be lost. And for someone with avoidant tendencies, this becomes even more intensified because their emotional system is already built around minimizing dependency and emotional exposure. So when love shows up consistently, they don't always interpret it as something rare, they interpret it as something stable. Something that will remain in the background regardless of how much they engage with it. In the beginning, this dynamic feels comfortable for them. There is no pressure to fully open up, no urgency to emotionally commit at a deeper level, no fear of being abandoned for their inconsistency. The empathic partner continues to show up, continues to understand, continues to give emotional space without withdrawing their love. So the avoidant individual unconsciously settles into a pattern where love becomes something that exists regardless of participation. It is there when they are available, and it is still there when they are distant. And because of this, the emotional value of that love becomes diluted in their perception. But human psychology is deeply rooted in contrast. We only fully recognize value when it is contrasted with absence. And this is where the turning point begins to form, often without immediate awareness. The empath, after prolonged emotional imbalance, begins to withdraw. Not out of manipulation, but out of emotional exhaustion and self-respect. They stop overextending. They stop explaining themselves repeatedly. They stop filling the emotional gaps that were never being acknowledged. At first, the avoidant may not register this shift as loss. They may interpret it as space, as independence, as things calming down, because their system is wired to associate less emotional intensity with relief. But what they don't realize is that the emotional baseline of the relationship is quietly changing. The consistent availability they once took for granted begins to fade. The predictable emotional access starts becoming uncertain. And this uncertainty is where emotional awareness begins to awaken. Because now, when they reach for connection, it doesn't automatically arrive in the same way. When they withdraw, there is no immediate emotional repair from the other side. When they return, the emotional warmth they were accustomed to is no longer as effortlessly available. And suddenly, they are forced to sit in a new emotional environment, one where love is no longer unconditional in its accessibility. This is where memory begins to activate differently. The mind starts replaying moments that were previously overlooked. The patience that was once assumed becomes noticeable. The emotional understanding that was once taken for granted begins to stand out. Not because it has changed, but because it is no longer immediately present. And absence has a way of sharpening perception. They begin to remember how it felt to be emotionally supported without needing to perform for it. They start recalling the comfort of being understood even in their silence. They begin to notice the emotional grounding that person brought into their otherwise internally chaotic world. But now, those experiences are no longer happening in real time, they are memories. And memories carry a different emotional weight when they are no longer accessible. This is the moment where emotional value becomes clear, but not through logic, through contrast. The avoidant realizes, often slowly and uncomfortably, that what they thought was normal in love was actually rare. but they only see it clearly when it is no longer freely available to them. And here is the deeper truth hidden in this experience. Human beings don't fully appreciate emotional consistency while they are still receiving it without interruption. It is only when that consistency is removed that its significance becomes undeniable. For the avoidant, this realization is not immediate. It builds gradually through silence, through emotional absence, and through the growing awareness that not every connection waits indefinitely. What once felt like something that would always be there begins to feel like something that has moved beyond reach. Absence doesn't create appreciation immediately because the human nervous system does not process loss as clarity. At first, it processes it as disruption. When a consistent emotional presence disappears, especially one that once provided safety, understanding, and emotional regulation, the first internal reaction is not gratitude or insight. It is confusion. The mind tries to restore what was familiar before it tries to understand what it meant. This is especially true for avoidant individuals, whose coping mechanism has long been to reduce emotional intensity rather than sit fully within it. So when the empathic partner begins to withdraw, the avoidant does not instantly experience a wave of realization about what they had. Instead, they experience a subtle emotional disturbance that is difficult to name. Things feel off, but not in a fully conscious way. There is no immediate label like I missed them or I lost something valuable. Instead, there is a quieter experience and emptiness in moments that used to feel regulated, a silence where emotional interaction used to exist, a lack of response where reassurance once arrived without effort. The first instinct of the avoidant mind is often to normalize this shift, to assume it is temporary, to believe that space is healthy, because space for them has always been associated with relief from emotional pressure. So initially, absence is misinterpreted as comfort. There is even a subtle sense of regained control. The emotional system calms down, not because everything is okay, but because stimulation has decreased. But emotional truth doesn't reveal itself in the first wave of distance. It reveals itself in the second wave, when the silence becomes consistent rather than temporary, when emotional access is no longer predictable, when the empath does not automatically return to fill the gap. That is when confusion begins to deepen into something more uncomfortable. The avoidant starts to notice the contrast between how things feel now and how things used to feel. But this realization does not arrive as a single moment of clarity. It arrives in fragments. A memory here, a feeling there, a moment of reaching out and not receiving the same warmth, a conversation that doesn't restore emotional comfort the way it once did. Each experience on its own feels small, but together they begin to form a pattern that the mind cannot ignore. And still, even then, the emotional system resists full acknowledgement, because accepting loss requires emotional vulnerability, and vulnerability is exactly what avoidance structures are built to avoid. So instead of saying I lost something important, the mind creates alternative explanations. Maybe they are busy. Maybe things just changed. Maybe I don't need that level of closeness anyway. These thoughts act as emotional buffers, protecting the individual from fully confronting the depth of what is missing. But avoidance cannot permanently override emotional truth, because feelings that are not processed do not disappear, they accumulate. And in quiet moments, when distraction fades and emotional defenses lower, the absence becomes more noticeable. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, but persistent. It is often in these quieter spaces late at night, during moments of reflection, or in situations where emotional comfort would have once been naturally present, that the impact of absence begins to surface more clearly. The avoidant may find themselves thinking about the empath without intending to, not necessarily with longing at first, but with recognition that something in their emotional environment has fundamentally changed. And this is where the shift begins. Not in immediate appreciation, but in delayed awareness. The mind slowly starts to connect emotional stability with the person who is no longer providing it. It starts to recognize that certain feelings of calm, understanding, and emotional grounding were not self-generated, they were relational. But even this recognition does not immediately transform into expression or action. It first has to pass through layers of resistance, pride, and emotional self-protection. Only over time does the reality become undeniable. What once felt like normal presence was actually a form of emotional support that is not easily replaced. And by the time this truth fully settles, it is no longer about confusion. It is about recognition of value in something that is no longer within immediate reach. The loss becomes real only when control is gone and replacement comfort fails, because avoidance psychology is deeply rooted in the illusion of emotional control. For someone with avoidant tendencies, the internal sense of safety is often built on the belief that they can regulate closeness at will. They can step in when they want connection, and step out when they feel overwhelmed. They can distance themselves when emotions feel too intense, and return when they feel ready again. This rhythm creates a false sense of power, not over others, but over emotional exposure itself. As long as this cycle continues successfully, loss does not fully register, because even if there is temporary distance, there is always an underlying assumption that access remains available. The empathic partner may express concern, may experience emotional strain, but they are still emotionally present, still reachable, still willing to reconnect. So the avoidant mind maintains an internal belief. Nothing is truly gone. It is just paused. And a paused connection does not require emotional grief. But everything begins to shift when that access is no longer guaranteed. When the empath stops returning instantly. When emotional responses are no longer immediate. When reassurance is no longer freely given. This is the moment control starts to dissolve. And for someone who has relied often unconsciously on emotional control as a way of managing vulnerability, this creates internal instability. At first, the avoidant may try to reassert that control. They might reach out casually, test the emotional waters, or behave as if nothing significant has changed. Because if the connection responds in the usual way, the illusion of control is restored. But when the response is different, slower, more distant, more bounded, that illusion begins to crack. And this is where the emotional reality starts to surface. They are no longer operating in a system where their emotional timing dictates the relationship. The empath is no longer adjusting themselves to maintain equilibrium. Instead, the emotional dynamic has shifted into unfamiliar territory, where access is conditional rather than automatic. This loss of control is often more emotionally destabilizing than the loss of the person itself in the early stages. Because what is being challenged is not just attachment, it is the internal belief that emotional distance can be reversed at convenience. When that belief is disrupted, the avoidant is forced into a space where they can no longer regulate emotional outcomes through withdrawal or delayed engagement. And when control disappears, something deeper begins to surface. The realization that the connection had more value than it was being treated with. But even then, the mind does not immediately accept this truth. It first tries to find substitutes. Replacement comfort becomes the next strategy. This is where distraction, new connections, or emotional avoidance behaviors often come into play. The avoidant may seek out new attention, new interactions, or new environments that provide temporary emotional relief, not necessarily because they have fully moved on, but because discomfort without control is difficult to sit in. Replacement becomes a way to avoid fully confronting the absence. However, replacement comfort rarely carries the same emotional depth as the original connection, especially when the original connection was rooted in genuine understanding and emotional attunement. So, while new distractions may provide temporary relief, they do not recreate the emotional grounding that was lost. They do not replicate the sense of being deeply seen, emotionally held, or intuitively understood. And slowly, this contrast becomes impossible to ignore. The avoidant begins to notice that while new interactions may fill time, they do not fill emotional space in the same way. There is a difference between stimulation and connection, between attention and understanding, between presence and emotional resonance. And that difference becomes more apparent when the original emotional anchor is no longer available. This is the point where loss becomes undeniable, not because the person is gone, but because the internal systems that once compensated for their absence are no longer effective. Control no longer works. Replacement no longer satisfies. Emotional neutrality is no longer achievable. And in that space, without distraction or illusion, the full weight of what was lost begins to surface with clarity that can no longer be easily dismissed. Empaths often leave not out of anger, but out of emotional exhaustion and self-respect. And this distinction is crucial because from the outside, it can easily be misunderstood. People tend to assume that departure always comes from a breaking point of rage or a dramatic emotional rupture. But for a deeply empathic person, the real ending is usually much quieter. It is not an explosion, it is a slow internal recognition that they are giving more than they are receiving, and that the imbalance is no longer something they can justify to themselves. In the beginning, the empath does not leave easily. In fact, they are often the ones who stay longer than most people would. They stay through inconsistency because they understand fear. They stay through emotional distance because they understand trauma responses. They stay through confusion because they believe clarity can be built through patience. Their natural instinct is not to abandon, but to understand, to hold space, to translate silence into meaning, and to believe that love can bridge emotional gaps. But over time, something subtle begins to shift inside them. It is not that their capacity to love decreases, it is that their capacity to ignore their own emotional needs diminishes. They start to notice the cost of constantly adapting. They notice how often they are the ones initiating repair. They notice how frequently they are the emotional stabilizer in moments where they are also the ones feeling destabilized. And slowly, the emotional math stops adding up. At first, they try to correct it gently. They communicate more clearly. They express needs without blame. They try to create understanding without creating pressure. But when those efforts are met with the same pattern of distance, avoidance, or inconsistency, something deeper begins to awaken within them. The realization that effort alone does not guarantee emotional reciprocity. And this is where exhaustion begins, not physical exhaustion, but emotional depletion. The kind that builds quietly over time, through repeated cycles of hope, adjustment, disappointment, and self-recalibration. It is not one big moment that breaks them. It is hundreds of small moments where they had to choose between their own emotional truth and keeping the connection alive. Eventually, they reach a point where they begin to ask themselves a different kind of question. Not how can I fix this, but why am I the only one trying to fix this? And that question is often the beginning of emotional clarity, because it shifts the focus from understanding the other person to understanding themselves. This is where self-respect enters the equation, not in a dramatic or ego-driven way, but in a grounded, quiet realization that love should not require self-abandonment. That being understanding does not mean being endlessly accommodating. That patience should not erase personal boundaries. And that emotional depth should not come at the expense of emotional well-being. When an empath reaches this stage, leaving is not impulsive, it is deliberate. It is not about punishment or teaching someone a lesson. It is about alignment. They begin to recognize that staying in a dynamic where their emotional needs are consistently secondary is slowly disconnecting them from themselves. And for an empath, losing connection with self is more painful than losing connection with another person. So they begin to withdraw not abruptly, but intentionally. They reduce emotional overextension. They stop over-explaining. They stop filling silence that is not being acknowledged. And in many cases, they give the other person subtle opportunities to meet them halfway. Not as tests, but as final attempts at balance. But when those opportunities are not met, the decision becomes clearer. The empath understands that continuing to stay in hope of change that is not actively happening is no longer love, it is self-neglect. And this realization carries a quiet finality. By the time they actually walk away, the emotional decision has already been made internally long before the physical departure. That is why it often feels sudden to the other person, especially to someone who was not fully aware of the internal cost being carried. But for the empath, it is the end of a long process of emotional reckoning. And even in leaving, there is often no hatred. There is sadness, yes. There is disappointment sometimes. But underneath it all is clarity. A clear understanding that love without balance eventually stops feeling like love and starts feeling like emotional erosion. And walking away becomes not an act of rejection, but an act of preservation of dignity, of peace, and of the ability to love again without losing oneself in the process. True emotional awakening for avoidance comes through loss, not persuasion, because avoidance is not dismantled by logic, it is softened by experience. You can explain emotional patterns to an avoidant. You can communicate needs clearly. You can offer patience, reassurance, and understanding. But none of that bypasses the core mechanism that drives their behavior, the instinct to protect themselves from emotional overwhelm by creating distance. As long as that strategy feels functional, it remains in place. Persuasion operates on the level of the mind, but avoidance is stored in the body and nervous system. It is a learned response, not just a conscious choice. So when someone tries to convince an avoidant to stay more present, open up more, or engage more deeply, it often triggers resistance rather than transformation. Because to the avoidant system, emotional closeness can feel like exposure, and exposure can feel like loss of control. So even loving conversations can be interpreted as pressure, even when they are gentle. This is why many empathic partners find themselves exhausted. They think if they just say it the right way, explain it more calmly, or love more consistently, the avoidant will eventually feel safe enough to change. But change does not happen through reassurance alone. It happens when the emotional consequences of avoidance become more painful than the avoidance itself. And that is where loss enters as the teacher. When the empath is still present, still available, still softening the emotional edges of the relationship, the avoidant can remain in a state of partial engagement. They can step in and out of connection without fully confronting the emotional cost of their patterns. There is always a safety net. There is always return access. There is always the assumption that understanding will continue to be offered, even in moments of distance. But when that consistent emotional availability is removed, something shifts internally, not immediately into insight, but into discomfort. The avoidant begins to experience the emotional space they once created, but now without the buffer of another person's regulation. And this is where the nervous system starts to register something new. Absence is no longer neutral. At first, they may still try to manage this discomfort using familiar strategies. Distraction, emotional minimization, rationalization. They may tell themselves they are fine, that they prefer space, that closeness was too much anyway. These narratives are protective. They are not lies in a conscious sense, they are coping mechanisms designed to reduce emotional intensity. But over time, those strategies start to weaken, because what the empath provided was not just attention, it was emotional regulation. It was the sense of being understood without needing to explain everything. It was the grounding presence that softened internal chaos. And once that stabilizing force is gone, the internal world becomes more noticeable. This is where the awakening begins, not as a sudden realization, but as a gradual emotional exposure. The avoidant starts to notice what is missing in other interactions. Conversations feel less grounding. Emotional moments feel less safe. There is a subtle but persistent sense that something once present is no longer there and cannot be easily recreated. And in that contrast, memory becomes sharper, not idealized fantasy but emotional truth. They begin to remember how it felt to be met with patience instead of pressure, with understanding instead of judgment, with emotional presence instead of distance. These memories become more vivid precisely because they are no longer being lived in real time. But this awakening is not comfortable. It does not arrive as relief. It arrives as recognition of cost, the cost of distance, the cost of avoidance, the cost of not fully engaging when emotional safety was available. And this realization often carries a quiet weight because it cannot be undone. What makes this moment powerful is that it is not forced by argument or persuasion. No amount of explaining could have created this level of internal clarity while the relationship was still intact in the same way. Because when access is still available, the nervous system does not fully reevaluate. Evaluate assumes continuity. It is only when continuity is broken that reassessment becomes inevitable. And in that space, without pressure, without persuasion, without someone continuously bridging the emotional gap, the avoidant is left alone with their own emotional reality. And that is where understanding begins, not as an idea, but as an experience that can no longer be ignored. Thank you for taking the time to listen and reflect. It truly means more than words can express. Goodbye for now, and may you carry clarity, strength, and self-respect into every connection ahead.